Good day, everyone. Good day to where you are. And this is Angelo Lorenzo once again. Today we are having a very special guest because, like me, he's also a writer. And I am going to introduce him formally. Albert Samaha is a journalist and author of creative nonfiction books. He is an investigative reporter for Buzzfeed News, where he covered stories related to narcotics and drug abuse, racial injustice, unlawful incarceration, sexual harassment, and the working conditions of food and service workers during the COVID-19 pandemic. As a recipient of prestigious awards, he has been recognized for his reports that contributed to positive social changes and policy reforms. His book, Never Ran, Never Will, Boyhood and Football in a Changing American's Inner City, has been adapted into a Netflix docuseries now titled We Are the Brooklyn Saints. Albert is also an athlete and has previously played football at the University of San Diego, where he earned his bachelor's degree. Currently, he lives in New York and juggles between being a professor of Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism, Columbia, where he earned his master's, and also as a reporter for BuzzFeed News. So, Albert, thank you very much for being here, and thank you for accepting the invitation for the interview.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Thank you. So, jumping ahead, let's go to your journey as a journalist. What got you interested in journalism?
I'd always been interested in journalism to a degree. I grew up reading the newspaper every morning at home. It was the sports section when I was a kid, scanned the headlines. I think I'd always sort of seen it something I was interested in. As a kid, I grew up wanting to be a professional dream through high school and college. But even through that, I subscribed to magazines and newspapers, and when I got to college, I wrote for the school paper, and I think when I realized I wasn't going to be a professional athlete, I just fully shifted all of my focus and energy to journalism. I'd always kind of been curious. I thought it was cool about how it's a job where you can just sort of explore ideas and find out what the secrets of the world are. And I like to write. I think everyone who writes probably has a little bit of like ego or narcissism tied to it. This belief. Those two sort of strains in me just sort of converged with journalism, and really from college on, from the high school, I couldn't really imagine myself pursuing any other track.
That's amazing. And based on your experience, you have really garnered a lot of recognition because of your efforts in both journalism as a man of many talents, also for your athletic abilities. And congratulations on your recent achievements, being recognized as a also as a like when you were 24, you were recognized as an emerging writer in one grant. Is that correct?
Hmm.
That's
It is.
amazing. So in one of your achievements, you've written a book about a creative nonfiction book about this team. It's I believe they're located in Brooklyn in New York. So what was your inspiration behind that book, which is entitled "Never Ran, Never Will: Boyhood and Football in a Changing American Inner City"?
I think one of the things that's always driven me journalistically, and one of the reasons I got into journalism too was, it's a very wide industry. It's a very homogenous industry. It's an industry dominated by people who grew up usually with money, and I had kind of always wanted to help present, use my own experience to represent things, the second generation immigrant experience, the experience of growing up around people that, I didn't grow up poor, but I grew up around a lot of people that grew up poor in rough neighborhoods. So really from the start of my journalism career, one of my objectives has always been to present underrepresented communities and to try to expose and reveal injustices and oppressions that are hurting underrepresented communities, communities of
Right.
color in the U.S. So that had always kind of been my objective from the start. And when I had always wanted to write a book, and I'd always sort of kept my eyes open for book ideas. And the idea for this one just began as a long newspaper story for the Village Voice, which is a local paper in New York I was writing for at the time. Um, and I wanted to cover the community of Brownsville, Brooklyn, and the football team was sort of just a vehicle for that. And when I was covering that community, I saw how essential or important that team was to a lot of people in the community. So I thought that was sort of a way to unite a lot of the ideas. I thought football also has some metaphoric value for the story I wanted to tell, because I wanted to tell the story about the cost of progress and what happens in America, even as crime rates drop, even as low-income communities are no longer as blighted and have a little more development than they had 20 years ago. What is the cost of that progress? Just like our evolving understanding of science and brain research has shown us that football has some really serious long-term consequences for its players.
Right.
I wanted to sort of use that as a metaphor for a lot of these domestic policies we have in the U.S. that on its face seem to be reducing crime and bringing more investment into previously underinvested communities. The cost of that is the people that had gone through the tough years and helped bring that community to its feet from those tough years often don't get to experience the good years, because the rent prices go up and there's very little housing policies protecting their ability to stay in their
Right.
communities. That was sort of the general topic, and I guess specifically this was one of those things while I was reporting on this team in that community. The story was just so rich, and there were so many characters and so many angles that I knew, within weeks of reporting it, that this would be that this story needed more than just a single article in a newspaper. That it had some potential for a book, and I just started reporting it as a book from there, and continued on for the next 4 years.
That's amazing. And well, as a journalist, you're the kind of like storyteller or journalist who is actually devoted into an advocacy. And I remember it was, I think, Christiane Amanpour who said that she would prefer to be truthful rather than neutral. So your kind of reporting is more of like a what should be than a what is. So it's still based on facts, but at the same time you're backing it up with a personal advocacy, which is to help uplift the lives of POC community in general. So as a POC person yourself, Albert, um, have you like noticed any differences between the struggles of various POC communities in America, especially like these days, racial tension has also resurfaced.
America was defined as sort of a binary in some sense, right? That there were, if you look at the Constitution, there are free
Right.
white men, and then there's
Mm-hmm.
everybody else, right?
Mm-hmm.
But at the time the founders wrote that, they weren't thinking about people that look like us. They were thinking about the white people, the black people that had as slaves, and then the native people who they conquered and genocided and all that. So I think that sort of was the fundamental root of a lot of how we've seen racial tensions play out today, which is that as more immigrant groups came, they were either classified as white or non-white, right? Some groups like Irish and Italian, they were initially classified as not white, but after a generation or two, with their accents gone, maybe they changed their names, they could assimilate fully into the white community. We've seen even some Middle Eastern groups do this, where if you can pass as white, you can um, attain a lot of the rights that are reserved for white people.
Yeah.
So for non-white people, I think it's a bit of a spectrum, right? I think what American history shows is that you know that Black and Native people were the people there from the start who the oppression was initially targeted at, right? Like
Right.
Black people began as slaves, and Native people began as a conquered people. So for those of us with immigrant ancestry, we sort of came from the other direction, right? Where we like Black people and Native people had no choice in the matter. We chose to come to America because we believed in its ideal. So that sort of gave us a weird tension point, because we came because we believed the stories of white people, right? Like would my family have come to the U.S. if the only accounts of the U.S. were written by Black people? If they'd grown up reading W.E.B. Du Bois and James Baldwin, they might have been like, well, maybe that's not the country for us. Maybe we want to go to Paris. Maybe we want to go to some other Ghana, some other place other than America. Then we come here and we realize, oh, actually, this country is designed for white people. So I think where the unity is amongst non-white people is just in that idea that this country was defined by whiteness, and a large faction of people in this country are devoted to maintaining the pillars of white supremacy and maintaining that sort of old caste system in America. But the important thing also is to distinguish that our histories are not identical, and that it's important for us to recognize those differences in our histories in order to figure out how our experiences are shaped. Like a lot of immigrants are familiar with like the model minority myth, this idea that some immigrants come and they follow the rules, and because they follow the rules, they're allowed to succeed. And when they succeed, that makes it very easy for them to dismiss the oppression other people face, right? Like I think especially in a lot of Asian communities, there is a lot of anti-Black racism, because a lot of Asian communities will say, well, their neighborhoods are poor because they're not working as hard as we are. And that's the sort of perspective that ignores the history, right? Like that
Right.
immigrant communities came on their will, oftentimes with a little bit of money, whereas Black communities have been oppressed and pillaged by institutions in America for generations.
Right.
So I think recognizing the differences in addition to the unifying forces is sort of essential for understanding how
Mhm.
America works. And sometimes it takes a couple generations for people to kind of come with their high hopes, only to realize what America actually has in store for us. And I think that unity is kind of more, gets more important as our immigrant groups realize the white people we think we're trying to side with are actually often supporting a caste hierarchy that's bad for a lot of people. And however America treats its worst, there's always the potential for them to treat other people that way who aren't white. Um, so I, it's I think that my perspective is like not just as a person of color, but as a person of color who's a child of immigrants. So it sort of begins with this optimistic. I grew up with a very optimistic view of America, and it really took experiences. It took learning the Black experience, learning the Native experience, not just obviously from books and history accounts, but also from people I went to school with and being in diverse environments. And if you watch sports and you listen to hip hop, you're exposed to people who grew up in circumstances that were oppressed. And I think that was sort of some of the cultural and social education that helped me understand the country.
Right. And that's where storytelling comes from, right? To really give voice to the communities who who originally were robbed of the access that they had. Or so yeah. So that's amazing because your book, Never Ran, Never Will, has also been adapted into a Netflix docuseries. So congratulations on that, Albert. So can you share how it was being adapted, and what part did you play in the adaptation in terms of the angle and the direction of the story?
Yeah, a production company reached out to me a couple months after the book was released.
Oh, wow.
One of the executives there had read the book and had liked it. And so they brought me in, and usually the way this process works, it can go two ways. They can either just kind of give you some money for the rights to the book, or they can give you some money for the rights, but then you also um, maintain a role in shaping the creative process. So I did the latter. So I worked with them in kind of designing the overarching idea. So when we had to try to sell the documentary idea to places like HBO or Netflix or ESPN, you kind of have to write a proposal. It's called a deck. So
Mhm.
I did that. I was the one that wrote the proposal that we were pitching to Netflix and other places. And I sat in on the meetings. I was mostly just there to give some context and explain what the big story was, and kind of get some of the sources for the book. But then once it got sold, and once we had a director, this guy Rudy Valdez, who's really brilliant, sort of just took a step back from there, and let Rudy handle it. I really liked Rudy as a director. I really trusted his vision, and he was like nice enough to kind of ask me like, how much bandwidth do you have? Do you want to be really involved in this? Do you want to just sort of take a step back? And I opted to just take a step back. I spent 5 years going to youth football practices in Brownsville, and I was kind of ready to not do that every day of my life anymore, and just kind of let him run with it. And he did great, and I'm like super happy with how the final product turned out. And my name will be in the credits as an executive
Yes.
producer, but I did very little. I did very little to actually shape the content of the 4 episodes. That was just all Rudy and the director. Most of my work was kind of on the front end in shaping the big picture. But when it came to the actual filmmaking process itself, I only went out to a couple of shoots, and also really just mostly to observe. It was in good hands. So in that way, it was like kind of quite a thrill. Um, it would have not been a thrill if the director in charge wasn't good and the final product was terrible. But that wasn't the case. It was great, and the director was great. So I kind of had the benefit of just waiting to see the final product and seeing the final product and watching it like everybody else.
That's amazing. So how about uh the players of the football team? How are they doing these days?
They're doing okay.
That's good.
Most of them are still in high school,
Mm-hmm.
like around graduating high school. A couple of them have gotten scholarships to really good academic institutions to play for their football team. Nobody has had a tragic end, so far, knock on wood.
Right.
But they're good. I think the cool thing about Facebook is it's very easy to kind of keep in touch with them and see
Yeah.
what they're up to. Um, so yeah, a couple of them, if you've read the book, Andrew and Marquise have gotten
Mm-hmm.
scholarships to some good
Wow.
schools, and the rest are graduating or near graduating.
Right. And I believe that they have bright future ahead of them. So that's amazing. So going to like really investigate or like dig deep into the concept of like sports and politics. Over the years, we have had some athletes speaking out against bigotry and things going on that attempt to eliminate groups of people. We've seen Colin Kaepernick kneeling down in his in while the national anthem has been playing. So do you think that sports in general, I'm not saying like football in specific, but sports like basketball, and other sports also, do you think that it is headed in a direction where athletes had to be political to succeed, or do athletes just have to like stay in their lane to win their game?
I think I I think it's up to the athlete. I think you can do both ways. I'm of two minds about it. On one hand, I think society,
Mm-hmm.
you know, it's we're just living a more political time, right? We're at a moment of rising authoritarianism and fascism around the world, and 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 I think it's just we've in many cases silence is political. Like there is no apolitical,
Right.
right? You take a stand, and by being silent, you are being political.
Mhm.
So on one hand, I think the expectation for athletes to make their positions clear is becoming greater, because fans are very passionate about their athletes and they want to know that the people they're rooting passionately for don't support fascists, and
Right.
and I think that's a fair thing for a fan to want, right? You don't want to buy someone's jersey until you know for sure you support them as a human being in addition to as an athlete. At the same time, I do get a little uncomfortable sometimes when people sort of demand athletes to make their political positions clear.
Right.
I
Mhm.
think it's okay if an athlete doesn't want to make their position clear, even if that
Mhm.
athlete, or especially if that athlete has a horrible ideology. I think it's okay for them to be quiet about it. If they're self-aware enough to know people aren't going to like this, that's a step of them knowing that there's a problem with their ideas. But also, like, they're athletes. That's their job is not to be political. And I think sometimes in culture we elevate celebrities beyond what we need from them. Like
Mhm.
because we develop such intimate relationships with celebrities, we build these expectations for them that I don't think we need to.
Yeah.
Like I wouldn't have a problem if I didn't know any athletes political. I don't know. I don't have a problem with that. But I don't think we should demand that athletes clarify their positions. Like if an athlete doesn't want to take a knee or does want to take a knee, I think either is fine. I think they should explain it if they have something interesting to say. But I think if they don't have anything interesting to say and don't want to explain it, I think that's fine too. And I think that's sort of one of the challenges where we're at right now is that silence can be complicity, but
Right.
also like they're athletes and they're not spending all their hours reading social histories of the country. You know what I mean? Like they might be any more informed than the next person. They just
Mhm.
happen to be a role model because they're athletes, and obviously it's important for them to use that platform. Um, so I'm of two minds about it. But yes, I do think, to answer your original question, that there is going to be only greater and greater expectations for athletes to take positions, just because it's just hard for anyone not to take a position the further we go down this road.
Right. And going back to what you said earlier about um, the POC experience, um, in 2017, you have written an excellent personal piece about the political and social landscape in the Philippines. So since we are also like living in political times these days, these discussions or like conversations about topics on political and social issues are like rampant or like prevalent nowadays. So you've written an essay entitled "Looking for Right and Wrong in the Philippines," which was first published by Buzzfeed and was selected into the Best American Travel Writing in 2018. So congratulations on that, Albert. As we live in a time when opinions clash, because there are always dissenters when it comes to politics, how divided is the Filipino-American community when it comes to the political and social landscape in the Philippines?
I think it's generational, at least from what I've seen. I think the younger generation, particularly the American-born generation, is more idealistic, particularly in terms of how they feel about Duterte.
Mm,
I think Duterte, when American media covers international folks, I think it's with a little bit less nuance. Like so oftentimes in U.S. articles about Duterte, you would see like in the description just like who many have compared to Trump or who has like Trump-like features. There's blah blah blah, a brash speaker, a brash populist like Trump and Bolsonaro or whatever, and they sort of lump all of these autocrats together, and I think that's wrong. Like Duterte and Trump couldn't be more different, right? Other than the fact that they speak like you're kind of dirty Tito, they really don't. Like they have different political histories, they have different agendas. They both are like kind of strong men, but beyond that, they have different ways of going about that. So I was always uncomfortable with that comparison. But I think that comparison plays a big role in why a lot of American-born Philippine people don't like Duterte.
mm,
Um, and I think a lot of the older generation, particularly the immigrant generation who grew up during the martial law period, I think are a bit more pragmatic with it, where their position is, um, you know, first of all, we've seen what corruption can do to the country. We've seen that even after revolution, corruption maintains,
mm,
and part of the reason they left the country was because they didn't believe that the problems could be fixed anytime soon. And so I think they were much more sympathetic to the idea that an autocratic leader comes in, puts their foot down, and even if they are keeping law and order outside the bounds of law and even ethics to a degree, that perhaps that is a necessary antidote to the problem. Um, I think, I mean, I don't think that's homogenous either way. I think there are some young Filipino Americans that do like Terte and some older ones that who don't. But yeah, I think it largely splits on generational lines. Especially those of us that grew up in America
mm,
have a lot more faith in institutions. My uncles called me naive. Like the Philippines isn't America. You can't just turn to the courts for these things. And I think part of it has to do with what is your level of faith in the role institutions can play to fix the country's problems. And I think those younger of us who didn't grow up in the Philippines and grew up in America have a much higher degree of faith in the concept of institutions and the power of institutions than a lot of people that grew up in the Philippines and saw that sometimes those institutions can either be corrupted or can be too weak to stop a strong man from taking all the money, killing people, doing whatever they want. So I think it's divided. I think it's less divided here than it is in the Philippines, though.
Right. I agree with what you said about how our generation influences our political ideology, and knowing that in the age of like social media, there has always been a practice of like freedom of expression, and but then again, there's also disinformation going on. So how does the Filipino American community in general, perceive the disinformation that's happening both in the United States and in the Philippines, knowing the fact that, it's clear that some falsities are being spread, um, especially by the supporters of, strong men and regimes that are in the guise of democracy, but then again, they are quite fascistic in tendencies.
I think I don't think there's anything particularly distinguishes how Filipinx people in the States um, interpret disinformation than any other group. I think I think it's hard. It's one of those things where people just sort of get swept up. I don't know what the statistics are for like how many Filipinx American people um subscribe to disinformation sites and things like that. I think that a lot of people I know, a lot of the relatives I know who do support Trump and do believe in conspiracy theories like QAnon and the left stems from their religion. I think one thing that American disinformation peddlers has done is they have exploited people's religious faith in order to brainwash them into believing other things. So one thing the Republican Party has done is they have made, and this has been decades old. They made abortion, anti-abortion position a top thing on their agenda. So a lot of Catholics in the States who don't have very many strong political beliefs other than being pro-life, they will trust whichever media source appears to be the most pro-life.
Right.
And what the right wing has done is they have taken this passionate belief that people care about and they have tied it to all these unrelated things where
Mhm.
they have gotten people that believe they've lured people by saying we're pro-life, and then they said, well, you trust me because I'm on your side on the most important issue. Now here's how you should feel about taxes and racial
Right.
justice and police
Mhm.
brutality. And I think that was sort of the start of it. And that's sort of been in place since the 80s and it escalated in the 90s, all the more in the 2000s. But
Mhm.
but what it's sort of done is created this large factions of people who have sort of gone down the slippery slope of where they get their media information. And what started as believing a media organization just because they seem pro-life or pro-Catholic, as the internet allowed the prevalence of more and more um, propaganda sites, essentially, it became harder for people to distinguish what's a valid site, what's not a valid site. And as every totalitarian society regime has ever done, the more you can raise questions of what sources are truthful, what sources are not truthful, the more you can confuse people, the more you can get people to say, I just don't know what's true. Who knows? The less ammunition, the fighters of that regime have to convince people otherwise. I don't know how to fix that. But to me, I think for a lot of Filipinx Americans, it started with religion, and that's what
Yeah.
the propaganda people have targeted in order to try to pull people into that disinformation.
Right, and it's really, I would agree with what you said about like religion being a factor in influencing people's beliefs, because it's also like happening in the mainland Philippines. A lot of Filipinos are still not, while they tolerate the LGBTQ plus community, but then we still haven't like legalized a lot of rights that are meant for the LGBTQ plus community. I mean, it for a country that is like the first like probably considered as the first democracy in Asia, we're so behind when it comes to like women empowerment, when it comes to like legal issues. I think the divorce bill has also not been legalized yet here, and also yeah, for the same sex marriage is also not yet legalized. But I have hopes that someday, politicians would see light in these issues. So yeah, thank you for sharing that, uh, Albert. So in your writing career, you have gained well-deserved recognition for your reports and stories. The Filipino literary community is evolving and growing with the emergence of authors like Randy Ribay, who is the author of Patron Saints of Nothing, and Elaine Castillo, who is the author of America is Not the Heart. um, they write diasporic narratives that are uniquely Filipino. With your experience as a Filipino in America, and also that you have also written a book, do you have plans to write fiction someday?
I don't know. I have no specific plans to write fiction, but I don't rule it out. Um, it seems maybe like it could be fun, but I don't think it's as fun as journalism. I think journalism is so much funner. I don't know. I like the
Yeah.
interviewing part. I like the research part. Um, I don't. I think of. I mean, I think about it. I would like to. I mean, yeah, I would like to write some maybe short stories one day and just see how it
Yeah.
feels.
Mhm.
But I don't have any like immediate plans
Mhm.
to write fiction. There's too much nonfiction I want to write first before I get to fiction.
Right, that's amazing. And I guess it's the thing about like being a journalist is that it's always going to be there's a lot of stories to tell, right? And for fiction though, there are plenty of like ideas to explore about, but I think both go like although they differ in many ways, they also tend to have the same like tell the same themes or tell the same advocacies. Like we've seen a lot of POC authors emerging these days, and yeah, that's amazing because uh, the publishing industry is also more open to um, and more inclusive to historically marginalized communities. And my last question, Albert, would be you also mentioned on your website that you are currently working on a forthcoming book entitled Conception. So, if it's okay to share about it, what can you tell us? Can you tell us something about it?
Absolutely. It's about my family's immigration story from the Philippines to the States. And through that story, kind of exploring how immigrant optimism crashes into American reality and sort of tracing our thread back through my ancestors, going all the way back to Spanish colonial days and sort of tracing how the forces of history, how the forces of colonialism shaped the decisions and the fates of my family and many other families. Um, and 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 sort of sort of taking a big picture historical perspective on why we ended up in the country and whether the sacrifices the migrating generation above me made were worth it, whether America was the right place to go, whether there's how me as a child of immigrant should sort of reckon with the conflicting lessons that I inherited from my mom's generation, which is on one hand, one lesson is America's the place to go. We gave up our middle class existence in the Philippines, even though the Philippines might have been under dictatorship at the time, even though it had some flaws at the time, It was of a higher standing than what we found across the ocean. Um, but we did it because we believed America was better. So that was lesson number one. Lesson number two was that, hey, if you ever believe that the place you're in isn't the best place for you, just leave, cut your ties. Who cares how many generations your ancestors have been there? If you can find a better place, go. And I think those two ideas sort of linger within every child of immigrants. Of like, okay, on one hand, I'm raised to believe that America is exceptional. On the other hand, I'm raised to believe that if that ever changes and I don't believe it anymore, I can leave. Obviously, the myth of American exceptionalism, if it hasn't already been exposed, like before 2020, which I would argue it has, but during 2020, that's just gone. That's just shattered. No one believes the myth of American exceptionalism anymore, except for the people that subscribe to these disinformation sites, and that's no longer there, right? So for someone like me, who my entire family is now in the States, all of them, and this is my home. This is my homeland. What would it take for me to leave? Is there, if Trump had won, if the coup attempt last week had been successful, if the coup attempt is successful next week or tomorrow or today, would that be enough for me to make the same decision my mom made when she was the same age I am now? I think that's sort of what I reckon with, and that's sort of those are sort of the questions that I try to, if not answer, explore in the book. This idea of what does it mean to have left the place that many generations of my blood, fought for against colonizers or collaborated with, in some cases. All they did on the islands, all they built on the islands, why they left, and what it would take for me to make the same decision.
Right. And when's the book coming out?
This fall, hopefully.
Oh, that's
I don't know the
amazing.
month yet, but sometime this year.
Well, it's gonna be something to look forward to this year. And congratulations on that again. So thank you very much, Albert, for being here and for explaining your thoughts and ideas on the questions that I asked. And congratulations once again on your winning streak uh, in both athletics and journalism. And good luck on your career. And I hope that it's going to be a good year for you, since 2020 has been a challenging year for many of us.
Thank you, Angelo. This was so fun. I really appreciate you having me. Anytime you want to chat, man, this is a good time. I
Yeah.
could have went another hour.
Right, right. Thank you very much, Albert. And whenever like you plan to visit the Philippines someday, well, we can have a chat or like over drinks or like anywhere.
I would love that. That would be great. That would be great. Are you in Cagayan?
Yeah, I live in Cagayan de Oro City, and it's north of Mindanao, so it's in the south.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So yeah, thank
Cool.
you very
Yeah, that
much.
would be great. Let me know. That's my
And
first. That's the first place I'm going once the world opens up again. So I'll let you know.
well, yeah, I'm looking forward to that. And maybe someday if like if I visit the States and like see my relatives there also, I might also drop by New York and watch Broadway and go to Central Park. So yeah, thank you very much, Albert, and have a good year.